Only a fool would marry a pauper like you.
Her fiancé's cruel words echoed in her ears. Only a fool would marry a pauper. Humiliated and abandoned by the man she loved, Eleanor Hartley was left to rebuild a broken life. But before she could pick up the pieces, Duke Thomas Ashford, a man of power and mystery, took her hand in front of the entire ballroom and married her on the spot. Was this the ultimate act of mercy or a devastating mistake? The truth? She wasn't the only one with something to lose. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Fall. The retiring room on the second floor of Lord Castlereagh's townhouse smelled of rosewater and powder, the air thick with the whispered confidences of London's finest ladies. Eleanor Hartley knelt on the Persian carpet, her skilled fingers working quickly to repair the torn hem of Miss Caroline Winters's gown. "There," Eleanor said, securing the final stitch with practiced efficiency. "No one will ever know it was damaged." Caroline, barely 18 and in her first season, looked down with relief, flooding her young face. "Oh, Miss Hartley, you've saved me from complete mortification. How can I ever thank you?" "No thanks necessary." Eleanor rose gracefully, smoothing her own gown, a pale lavender silk that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, but remained one of her finest. "We've all had wardrobe mishaps. The trick is handling them with composure." She handed Caroline her reticule and watched the girl hurry back to the ballroom, youth and optimism radiating from every step. Eleanor remembered feeling that way once before 3 weeks ago, when her world had shattered with her father's halting confession in his study. "Eleanor, my dear, I must tell you something. The shipping investments, they've failed. All of them. And the debts." His voice had broken. "The estate is already sold. We have nothing left." Eleanor pushed the memory aside and checked her reflection in the gilt mirror. 26 years old, presentable if not beautiful, with dark brown hair arranged in an elegant chignon and grey eyes that her mother had always called thoughtful. Her face revealed nothing of the anxiety churning beneath her practiced composure. She descended the stairs and paused at the ballroom entrance, letting her gaze sweep across the glittering assembly. Lord Castlereagh's spring ball was always one of the season's finest events, and tonight was no exception. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over silks and jewels, while the orchestra played a lively country dance. The scent of hothouse flowers mingled with expensive perfumes and beeswax from hundreds of candles. Then Eleanor's eyes found him. Lord Edward Beaumont stood near the refreshment table, his blonde hair gleaming in the candlelight, his blue eyes fixed on her with an expression that made her stomach clench. Cold, determined, final. For 3 weeks, Eleanor had watched Edward grow distant. His calls had become infrequent, his conversations stilted, his kisses once warm and promising perfunctory at best. She'd told herself it was merely wedding nerves, that his love would withstand the change in her circumstances. After all, he had courted her for nearly a year, had declared his devotion, had slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger with tears in his eyes. But the set of his jaw as he crossed the ballroom toward her, flanked by Lord Pemberton and Mr. Winthrop, told Eleanor everything she'd been trying not to acknowledge. "Miss Hartley," Edward's voice carried the clipped courtesy one might use with a tradesman, "I require a moment of your time." Around them, conversations began to fade. Fans paused mid-flutter. Eleanor felt the weight of attention shifting toward them like a physical force. Edward had chosen this moment deliberately. Maximum witnesses, maximum humiliation. Of course, Lord Beaumont. Eleanor kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Edward drew himself up, his handsome features arranged in an expression of noble suffering. "I'm afraid circumstances have forced me to make a difficult decision. After much consideration, I find I must end our engagement." The words landed like blows, though Eleanor had known they were coming. Still, hearing them spoken aloud, in front of half of London's elite, felt like being stripped naked in public. "I see." Eleanor's voice emerged calmer than she felt. "Might I ask what circumstances have changed?" Edward's lip curled slightly. "Miss Hartley, let us not play games. Your family's financial collapse is known to everyone. I require a wife who brings something of value to the union connections. Fortune, proper standing." He paused, and Eleanor saw the cruelty in his eyes, that she'd somehow missed during their courtship. Only a fool would marry a pauper. I will not saddle myself with a wife who brings nothing but debts and disgrace. The ballroom had fallen completely silent now. Eleanor felt dozens of eyes on her, some pitying, most gleaming with the peculiar satisfaction people took in witnessing another's downfall. Lady Ashworth's fan snapped open with a sound like a gunshot. The Duchess of Hartfield whispered something to her companion. Lord Pemberton, standing at Edward's elbow, looked vaguely uncomfortable but said nothing. Eleanor's first instinct was to defend herself, to explain that her father's misfortune was not a moral failing, that her worth as a person hadn't changed simply because her bank account had. But she understood, with sudden clarity, that nothing she said would matter. To these people, to Edward, she had become worthless the moment her dowry evaporated. So instead, Eleanor lifted her chin and met Edward's cold gaze directly. "Then I release you from any obligation, Lord Beaumont. I would not wish to burden you with foolishness." The response clearly wasn't what Edward had expected. He'd anticipated tears, perhaps, or begging. His expression flickered with confusion before settling back into aristocratic disdain. "That's very understanding of you." He reached for her hand, and Eleanor forced herself not to flinch as he removed his grandmother's ring from her finger. The emerald had never fit quite right anyway. "I wish you well in finding a more suitable match," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. "I'm certain there are many young ladies whose fortunes will meet your exacting standards." The subtle barb wasn't lost on those listening. A few uncomfortable titters rippled through the crowd. Edward's face flushed, but Eleanor didn't wait for his response. She turned, spine straight, shoulders back, and walked toward the terrace doors. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the French doors ahead, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. She would not run. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. One foot in front of the other. Breathe. Don't stumble. Almost there. The whispers started before she'd gone 10 steps. Did you see her face? Poor thing. But really, what did she expect? Beaumont was wise to cut ties before the wedding. "I heard her family hasn't a shilling left. My mother always said the Hartleys lived beyond their means." Each whisper felt like a needle pressed into her skin, but Eleanor kept walking. The terrace doors seemed impossibly far away, but finally, her trembling hand found the brass handle. The cool evening air hit her face like a benediction. Eleanor stepped onto the stone terrace and pulled the doors shut behind her, muffling the ballroom's noise. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing, her hands clenched at her sides. Then her legs carried her to the balustrade, and she gripped the cold stone so hard her knuckles turned white. The formal gardens stretched before her in the fading April light, perfectly manicured hedges, geometric flower beds, gravel paths leading to nowhere she wanted to go. The composure she'd maintained so carefully began to crack. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. "Don't cry. Don't you dare cry where someone might see." 5 minutes. Her entire future had been destroyed in less than 5 minutes. The engagement she'd cherished, the wedding she'd planned, the life she'd imagined gone. And worse than losing Edward himself was the realization of what she'd actually lost: security, position, respectability. Without a husband, without a fortune, Eleanor faced a future as a governess or companion, if she was lucky, dependent on charity, if she wasn't. Her father's anguished face rose in her mind, her mother's silent tears. They'd already lost everything: the estate in Somerset, where Eleanor had grown up, the London townhouse they'd occupied for 20 years, most of their furniture and belongings. They were living on borrowed time in rented rooms, surviving on the goodwill of increasingly distant relatives, and now Eleanor had lost her one chance to help them, to secure at least her own future, if not theirs. A bitter laugh escaped her throat. 3 weeks ago, she'd been the envied fiancée of a wealthy viscount, her future bright with promise. Now she was the object of pity and gossip, cast aside like a broken toy. Behind her, the ballroom's music and laughter continued, muffled by the glass doors. They were probably still talking about her, dissecting every word of the exchange, speculating on what she'd do now. Tomorrow, the gossip would spread through every drawing room in London. By week's end, she'd be a cautionary tale, the girl who thought love mattered more than money. Eleanor loosened her death grip on the balustrade and forced herself to breathe slowly. In, out, in, out. She would not collapse. She would not give them that satisfaction either. Gradually, as the cool air cleared her head, a different emotion began to replace the devastation. Not quite anger that would come later, but something harder, more resolute. Edward had shown her exactly who he was, a man who valued pounds sterling over character, who performed cruelty for an audience, who measured worth in bank balances. And if she was honest with herself, she'd seen hints of it during their courtship, the way he dismissed servants, his contempt for anyone he considered beneath him, his preoccupation with status and appearances. She'd ignored those signs because she'd wanted the dream he represented. But perhaps the dream itself had been flawed from the beginning. The terrace doors opened behind her, releasing a burst of music and voices before closing again. Eleanor stiffened, preparing to face whoever had followed her out. But when she turned, ready to deliver a cutting dismissal, she found herself looking into the eyes of a stranger. A tall man, in impeccably tailored evening clothes, stood a respectful distance away, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his grey eyes assessing her with an intensity that should have been rude, but somehow wasn't. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly. His voice was deep, cultured, with an underlying warmth that surprised her. "I merely wished to ensure you were well." Eleanor straightened, summoning the last reserves of her dignity. "I'm perfectly well, sir. I simply required some air." The man's expression suggested he didn't believe her for a moment, but he had the grace not to say so. Instead, he simply nodded and turned to leave. "Wait." The word escaped before Eleanor could stop it. He paused, looking back at her with those penetrating grey eyes. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for not offering empty platitudes or false sympathy. That was kind." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a fellow soul who understood that sometimes kindness meant leaving things unsaid. "You're welcome, Miss Hartley." He inclined his head and disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving Eleanor alone with the twilight and her shattered dreams. But as she stood there, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would not let this break her. She would not become bitter or defeated. Whatever came next, spinsterhood, poverty, obscurity, she would face it with her dignity intact. "I will not let them see me broken," she thought fiercely. "Whatever comes next, I will face it with my head high and my character whole. They can take my fortune, my position, my prospects, but they cannot take who I am." The terrace doors opened again, and this time it was her father, his kind face etched with worry. "Eleanor, my dear, let's go home." Eleanor took his offered arm and walked back through the ballroom without looking left or right, past the whispers and the stares, past Edward, already dancing with another young lady as though nothing had happened, past the glittering chandeliers and the false smiles. Tomorrow, she would begin figuring out how to survive in a world that measured her worth in guineas. But tonight, she had survived the worst moment of her life without falling apart. And that, Eleanor told herself as the carriage carried her away from Lord Castlereagh's ballroom, would have to be enough. Chapter 2. The Witness. Duke Thomas Ashford had been standing near the terrace doors for the better part of an hour, nursing a glass of wine. He had no intention of drinking and contemplating an early departure. At 32, he'd attended enough of these events to find them tedious, the same conversations, the same political posturing, the same desperate mothers parading their daughters before him like prize livestock. Then Lord Edward Beaumont had begun his public execution of Miss Eleanor Hartley, and Thomas had found himself unable to look away. He'd witnessed the entire brutal scene. Beaumont's calculated approach, the deliberate gathering of witnesses, the cold pronouncement of rejection delivered with just enough volume to carry across the ballroom. "Only a fool would marry a pauper." The words had landed like a slap, and Thomas had felt an immediate surge of cold fury at the casual cruelty of it. But it wasn't Beaumont's cowardice that held Thomas's attention. He'd long since learned that most of society's so-called gentlemen were anything but. It was Miss Hartley's response. She hadn't begged, hadn't wept, hadn't created the dramatic scene that Beaumont had clearly anticipated and that the watching crowd had eagerly awaited. Instead, she'd stood there with her spine straight and her chin lifted, and released Beaumont from his obligation with more grace than he deserved. Then she'd walked through that silent, staring crowd as though she were a queen passing through her court, not a woman whose world had just shattered. Thomas knew something about shattered worlds. He'd been 22 when his father died suddenly, leaving Thomas with a dukedom drowning in debt and mismanagement. The old duke had been fond of expensive horses and poor investments, and Thomas had spent his first month as Duke of Ashford sitting in his study, staring at ledgers that showed nothing but red ink and ruin. 10 years. It had taken him 10 years of calculated investments, ruthless efficiency, and relentless work to rebuild what his father had nearly destroyed. He'd sacrificed friendships, leisure, and any pretense of a normal life. He'd become known as the Duke who preferred account books to balls, business meetings to social calls. And through it all, there had been Lady Vivian Blackwood, waiting like a prize he was supposed to claim once he'd made himself worthy of her. The betrothal had been arranged before his father's death, a strategic alliance between two powerful families. Vivienne was beautiful, accomplished, perfectly bred for the role of Duchess. On paper, she was everything a man in his position should want. In reality, their rare conversations left Thomas feeling hollow. Vivienne discussed fashion and gossip with great animation, but when he tried to engage her on matters of substance, estate management, political reform, the implications of the wars with Napoleon, her eyes glazed with polite disinterest. She wanted a title and the position that came with it. He wanted something more. He'd simply never been able to articulate what that something was. Until now, watching Miss Hartley grip the terrace balustrade with white-knuckled hands, her composure finally cracking now that she believed herself alone. Thomas set down his wineglass and moved toward the terrace doors. Behind him, the ballroom buzzed with excited gossip, already dissecting and reshaping what they'd witnessed into the most scandalous version of events. He heard Beaumont's name, heard speculation about Miss Hartley's future, heard the particular tone of voices that suggested people were enjoying her downfall far too much. The terrace was cooler than the overheated ballroom, the April evening carrying a hint of the day's rain. Miss Hartley stood at the balustrade, staring out at the darkening gardens with an expression that made Thomas's chest tighten unexpectedly. She wasn't crying. She was simply standing there, holding herself together through sheer force of will. Thomas cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Forgive the intrusion. I merely wished to ensure you were well." She turned, and Thomas got his first clear look at her face. Not beautiful in the classical sense, her features were too strong for that, her grey eyes too direct, but striking in a way that suggested intelligence and character, the kind of face that would grow more interesting with time rather than less. "I'm perfectly well, sir." Her voice was steady, controlled. "I simply required some air." Thomas recognized the lie for what it was, a necessary fiction to preserve her dignity. He respected that. "Of course," he said, turning to leave. "Wait." He paused, looking back. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not offering empty platitudes or false sympathy. That was kind." Thomas inclined his head and stepped back into the ballroom, but he didn't rejoin the festivities. Instead, he positioned himself where he could observe the terrace doors, waiting. When Miss Hartley finally re-entered the ballroom on her father's arm, Thomas studied them both. Mr. Hartley looked older than his years, his face drawn with worry and shame, but he held his daughter with protective tenderness, and she leaned on him with genuine affection. That told Thomas something important. Despite their financial ruin, despite the social disgrace, the Hartleys still had what mattered: genuine care for one another. How many of the wealthy families in this ballroom could claim the same? Thomas watched them leave, noting the whispers that followed in their wake, the way conversations stopped and started as they passed. Miss Hartley kept her head high throughout, her bearing that of a woman who refused to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control. The decision that had been forming in Thomas's mind throughout the evening suddenly crystallized into certainty. He'd been dreading his inevitable marriage to Vivian, the hollow conversations, the performative affection, the lifetime of pretending that title and wealth were enough to build a partnership on. But what if there was an alternative? What if he could find someone who actually understood the value of rebuilding from ruin? Someone who possessed genuine strength and intelligence rather than just the appearance of it. Someone exactly like Eleanor Hartley. Thomas signaled to his secretary, who materialized at his elbow with practiced efficiency. "Henderson, I need you to make inquiries." Discreetly. "Of course, Your Grace." "Regarding?" "The Hartley family. Current address, financial situation, social standing, everything." Henderson's eyebrows rose fractionally, but he simply nodded. "I'll have the information by morning. And Henderson, I'll need their direction. I intend to call on Miss Hartley tomorrow afternoon." Now Henderson looked genuinely surprised. "Your Grace, forgive me, but that will be all, Henderson." "Of course, Your Grace." Thomas left Lord Castlereagh's ball shortly after, his mind already racing through possibilities and calculations. He'd built a dukedom from near ruin, through strategic thinking and careful planning. Surely he could apply those same principles to something as important as choosing a wife. The more he considered it, the more sense it made. Miss Hartley needed security and position. He needed a partner with genuine substance rather than an ornamental wife who would bore him to distraction. It was a practical arrangement that would benefit them both. And if there was something about her dignity in the face of devastation that had struck him more deeply than he wanted to examine, well, that was simply fortuitous. Mutual respect would make the arrangement more pleasant for them both. By the time Thomas's carriage reached his London residence, he'd made his decision. Tomorrow, he would make Miss Eleanor Hartley an offer she'd be foolish to refuse. The irony wasn't lost on him. Beaumont had called her a pauper no one but a fool would marry. Thomas would prove him spectacularly wrong on both counts. He settled into his study with a brandy, already planning exactly what he would say. The conversation would need to be direct. Miss Hartley didn't strike him as someone who appreciated manipulation or false sentiment. He would be honest about what he needed and what he could offer. A partnership built on mutual respect and practical considerations. It was, Thomas reflected, far more than most society marriages could claim. The clock struck midnight, and Thomas raised his glass in a silent toast to the woman who'd walked through a hostile ballroom with her dignity intact. Tomorrow, he would give her the means to walk through every ballroom in England as a duchess. And in return, she would give him what Vivian never could, a partner worth having. Chapter 3. The Proposition. Eleanor had not slept. She'd lain in her narrow bed in the rented rooms her family now occupied, staring at the water-stained ceiling and replaying every mortifying moment of the previous evening. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard Edward's voice. Only a fool would marry a pauper. By dawn, her eyes burned with unshed tears and exhaustion. She rose, dressed in one of her simpler morning gowns, the blue muslin that had seen better days, and went downstairs to find her mother already weeping quietly over her embroidery. "Mama, please," Eleanor said gently, kneeling beside her chair. "It's done. No amount of tears will change it. But your future, Eleanor, your prospects." Her mother's voice broke. "What will become of you?" "What indeed?" Eleanor looked around the shabby drawing room that served as their primary living space. The walls showed lighter rectangles, where paintings had hung before being sold. The furniture that remained was mismatched pieces, too worn or unfashionable to fetch decent prices. They dismissed all but one servant, and even her wages were in question. Eleanor's father entered, his face haggard from his own sleepless night. "I've been thinking," he said heavily, settling into the threadbare armchair. Perhaps Eleanor could find a position as a governess. The Wilmots might know of a family. "A governess?" Her mother's voice pitched higher. "Our daughter? A governess? What would you have her do, Mary? We have no money for a season, no connections left to make an advantageous match." Her father's tone was gentle but firm. "We must be practical. Or perhaps we should move to the countryside, somewhere the living is cheaper. I have a distant cousin in Yorkshire." "Yorkshire?" Her mother looked horrified. "We might as well move to the ends of the earth." Eleanor listened to them discuss her future as though she weren't in the room, feeling the walls close in around her. A governess position would mean leaving London, living in someone else's household, subject to their whims and mercies. And for what? £30 a year and a room in the attic? The knock at the door startled all three of them. They rarely received callers anymore. Most of their former friends had quietly disappeared once the financial situation became known. Their lone servant, Mrs. Dawson, appeared in the doorway looking flustered. "Miss Eleanor, there's a... that is to say..." She swallowed hard. "The Duke of Ashford is here to see you," Eleanor's mother gasped. Her father sat up straighter, confusion crossing his face. "The Duke of Ashford?" Eleanor repeated, though she'd heard perfectly well. Her mind flew back to the previous evening, the man on the terrace, his quiet courtesy, his promise to call. She'd thought it merely a polite fiction. "He's requested a private audience with you, miss." "Mrs." Dawson twisted her apron nervously. "I've shown him to this room, as we have nowhere else suitable." Eleanor's father stood quickly. "Mary, come, we'll give them privacy." "But surely," her mother began. "Come, my dear." Her father took his wife's arm and guided her from the room, leaving Eleanor alone with her thundering heart. Duke Thomas Ashford entered a moment later, and Eleanor was struck again by his presence. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. His clothing was impeccable, a dark blue coat that fit him perfectly, buff breeches, Hessian boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked absurdly out of place in their shabby drawing room. "Your Grace," Eleanor curtsied, acutely aware of her faded dress and the room's deficiencies. "Thank you for calling. Please, won't you sit?" Thomas glanced at the available seating, a worn sofa with a visible stain on one cushion, or the chair her father had just vacated. He chose the chair, settling into it as though it were a throne. "Miss Hartley, I appreciate your seeing me." His voice was direct, businesslike. "I have a proposition to put before you, and I would prefer to be frank rather than waste both our time with social niceties." Eleanor sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. "I confess, Your Grace, I cannot imagine what proposition you might have for me. I need a wife." The words were blunt, almost startling in their directness, but not the ornamental sort that society expects. "I need a partner, someone who can manage an estate, engage in meaningful conversation, and navigate society with intelligence, rather than just breeding. Someone real, Miss Hartley, not another performance." Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon?" Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression intense. "I've been betrothed to Lady Vivian Blackwood since before my father's death. It was a strategic match arranged by our families, all about alliances and bloodlines and political advantage. But in 10 years, Vivian and I have never once had a genuine conversation. She discusses fashion and gossip. I need substance. Your Grace, I'm not certain I understand. I'm proposing marriage, Miss Hartley, to you." The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, as though the floor had become unsteady beneath her feet. "You cannot be serious," she managed. "I'm entirely serious." Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "I ended my betrothal to Lady Vivian this morning. She was displeased, but our arrangement was always more about family strategy than personal attachment." Eleanor's mind raced, trying to make sense of this impossible situation. "Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but why would you choose a woman with no fortune, no connections, and a family name now associated with failure? You could have anyone." "I don't want anyone." Thomas's voice carried quiet conviction. "I want someone who understands what it means to rebuild from ruin, someone who demonstrates genuine character rather than performing for an audience. You walked through that ballroom last night with more dignity than half the titled ladies in London possess. You managed your family's household for years. That tells me you're capable and practical. And from our brief conversation, I could tell you actually think about matters of substance." "This is madness," Eleanor whispered. "Is it?" Thomas tilted his head slightly. "I need a duchess who can actually partner with me in managing estates and navigating political waters. You need security and position. It's a practical arrangement that benefits us both." "You're describing a business arrangement, not a marriage." "Yes." Thomas's honesty was almost brutal. "I'm not offering you romantic love or false promises, Miss Hartley. I'm offering you partnership, respect, security, and the opportunity to build something meaningful together. I can provide wealth and position. You can provide the qualities that make those things worth having." Eleanor stood abruptly, moving to the window to gather her thoughts. Outside, London continued its usual business carriages rolling past, vendors calling their wares, people living their ordinary lives. Meanwhile, inside this shabby drawing room, a duke was proposing the most extraordinary arrangement Eleanor had ever heard. "Lady Vivienne," Eleanor said finally, turning back to face him, "does she truly know you've ended the betrothal?" "I told her this morning." She was displeased. Thomas's expression suggested that was an understatement. "But as I said, our arrangement was never based on genuine affection. She'll recover and find another suitable match." "And your terms?" Eleanor asked, needing to understand the full scope of what he was proposing. "What exactly would this partnership entail?" Thomas stood, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Complete honesty between us. No pretense, no games. Mutual respect in all matters. Separate bedchambers. I won't force intimacy you don't desire. But in public, we present a united front, and I want your genuine involvement in estate management. Your intelligence, your perspective, your capabilities, I want to use them, not waste them on embroidery and morning calls." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a spark of something interest, perhaps, or possibility. "And heirs? Surely you need." "Eventually, perhaps, but that's a discussion for another time." Thomas paused. "I must return to my country estate in 1 week to manage urgent business. If you accept, we marry before I leave quietly, quickly, without the spectacle that would invite more gossip. You would accompany me as my duchess." 1 week? Eleanor's voice rose. "Your Grace, that's hardly time to what? Plan a grand wedding that neither of us wants? To endure weeks of speculation and gossip?" Thomas shook his head. "Better to present society with an accomplished fact than give them time to interfere." Eleanor sank back onto the sofa, her mind whirling. A week ago, she'd been planning her wedding to Edward. Now she was being offered a completely different future, one without love, but also without lies. "I need time to think," she said quietly. "Of course. Take until this evening." Thomas moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Hartley, I want you to understand something. I'm not rescuing you. This isn't charity or pity. I'm proposing a partnership between equals. You would be doing me as much service as I you. Perhaps more." After he left, Eleanor sat in stunned silence until her parents crept back into the room. "Eleanor?" Her father's voice was cautious. "What did the Duke want?" "He asked me to marry him," her mother gasped. Her father sank heavily into his chair. "The choice is yours, Eleanor," her father said after a long moment. "I will not force you into any arrangement, no matter how advantageous it might appear." "Advantageous?" her mother found her voice. "It's a dukedom, Thomas. Security, position, respectability, everything we've lost. It's also a marriage," her father countered. "Eleanor deserves to choose her own path." Eleanor listened to them debate, but their words seemed distant. Her mind was already working through the impossible calculus of her situation. Option 1. Refuse the Duke's offer. Become a governess or companion, dependent on others' charity. Watch her parents sink deeper into poverty and shame. Live her life as a cautionary tale. Option 2. Accept. Become a duchess. Have security, position, purpose. Partner with a man who at least respected her intelligence, even if he didn't love her. That evening, alone in her small room, Eleanor lit a candle and pulled out writing paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she dipped her pen in ink. "I once dreamed of love," she thought, staring at the blank page. "I dreamed of passion and romance, and a man who would sweep me off my feet. But Edward taught me that romantic dreams mean nothing when circumstances change. The Duke is offering something more valuable than pretty words and empty promises. He's offering honesty, respect, and partnership. If I must marry for practical reasons, and I must better a man who's honest about what he wants than one who would deceive me with false affection." Eleanor began to write, her hand growing steadier with each word. "Your Grace, I have considered your proposition carefully. I accept your terms and your offer of partnership. I understand this is a practical arrangement based on mutual benefit rather than romantic attachment. I believe honesty and respect provide a stronger foundation for marriage than sentiment alone. I will be ready to proceed as you outlined. Respectfully, Eleanor Hartley." She sealed the letter with wax, her hands no longer shaking. Tomorrow, she would send it, and 1 week from now, she would become the Duchess of Ashford, not out of love, not even out of hope, but out of clear-eyed pragmatism and the determination to build something meaningful from the ruins of her old life. It wasn't the future she'd imagined, but perhaps it was the future she actually needed. Chapter 4. The Morning Wedding. Dawn broke over London in shades of pink and gold, but Eleanor had been awake for hours, watching the darkness gradually lighten beyond her window. She'd barely slept all week, not since sending her acceptance to the Duke and setting into motion a series of events that felt both inevitable and impossible. 7 days. That's all it had taken to transform her life completely. The week had passed in a blur of hasty preparations. Thomas, she was trying to think of him as Thomas now, not the Duke, had obtained a special license with alarming efficiency. There had been no time for banns, no announcement in the papers, no grand preparations, just quiet, efficient arrangements that spoke of a man accustomed to making things happen through sheer force of will and considerable influence. Eleanor's mother had worked miracles with the pale blue silk dress, altering it to fit properly and adding fresh trim to disguise its age. It was simple, elegant, nothing like the elaborate confection Eleanor had once spent hours designing with Edward in mind. That dress, with its layers of Belgian lace and seed pearl embroidery, had been sold along with everything else. This dress suited her better anyway, simpler, more honest. "Eleanor?" Her father's voice came softly from the doorway. "It's time, my dear." She turned from the window, smoothing the silk over her hips. Her father stood in his best coat, slightly worn at the elbows, but still respectable, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Papa, please don't," Eleanor whispered. "If you cry, I'll cry, and I refuse to arrive at my wedding with red eyes." He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "You've always had more strength than the world gave you credit for," he said quietly. "Show them what you're made of, Eleanor. Show them all." Eleanor squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I intend to." The church Thomas had chosen was small, tucked away in a quiet corner of Mayfair, far from the fashionable parishes where society weddings drew crowds of curious onlookers. Eleanor was grateful for that. The last thing she wanted was an audience of gossips watching her marry a duke 1 week after being publicly rejected by a viscount. The whispers had already started, of course. London society thrived on scandal, and Eleanor's hasty marriage to the Duke of Ashford was providing ample fuel for speculation. She'd heard some of it secondhand. Her mother's remaining friends had been all too eager to share what was being said. He must have compromised her somehow. Perhaps she's with child, someone else's child. The Duke has always been odd. This proves it. Eleanor pushed the whispers from her mind as the carriage stopped before the church. Let them talk. In a few hours, she would be a duchess, and their opinions would matter even less than they did now. The church interior was cool and dim, lit by morning sun filtering through stained glass windows. The space was almost empty, only immediate family present. Eleanor's mother sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her, Thomas's mother, the Dowager Duchess, sat ramrod straight, her expression carefully neutral. Then Eleanor's gaze found Thomas, waiting at the altar. He wore formal morning dress, a dark blue coat that emphasized his broad shoulders, a perfectly tied cravat, buff breeches, and polished Hessian boots. His posture was military straight, every inch the Duke, but Eleanor noticed the slight tension in his jaw. Was he nervous? The thought was oddly comforting. The vicar, a nervous young man who kept glancing at Thomas with barely concealed awe, cleared his throat. "Shall we begin, Your Grace?" Thomas nodded once, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. Eleanor walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, her steps steady despite the unreality of the moment. This was happening. In minutes, she would be married to a man she'd known for barely a week, a man who'd proposed a business arrangement rather than a love match, a man who was, nonetheless, offering her more honesty than Edward ever had. Her father placed her hand in Thomas's and stepped back. Thomas's grip was warm, steady, grounding. Eleanor looked up at him and saw something in his eyes, not love, but perhaps respect, recognition. The vicar began the ceremony, his voice slightly unsteady. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of..." Eleanor barely heard the familiar words. Her attention was fixed on Thomas, on the way he looked at her with complete focus, as though she were the only person in the room. When the vicar asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence felt heavy with all the people who weren't there to answer society, with its judgment and expectations conspicuously absent. Then came the vows. "Thomas Edmund Ashford, wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife?" "I will." His voice was clear, deliberate, holding Eleanor's gaze as though ensuring she understood he meant every word. "Eleanor Catherine Hartley, wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband?" Eleanor's hand trembled slightly in Thomas's. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a subtle gesture of reassurance. "I will." Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected, clear and sure. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of responses and prayers. Then the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Thomas leaned down to kiss her. It was brief, formal, a light press of lips that lasted barely a moment, but his hand at her waist was gentle, and Eleanor caught a hint of sandalwood and something else, something uniquely him. When they parted, she felt oddly breathless. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a ring, not the simple gold band the vicar had blessed, but the Ashford family ring, a magnificent sapphire surrounded by diamonds, set in gold so old it had a warm, burnished glow. "This has been worn by every Duchess of Ashford for 3 generations, Thomas said quietly, sliding it onto her finger beside the wedding band. The ring was heavy, substantial, and fit perfectly. He must have had it sized for her. "You honor my family by wearing this." The unexpected warmth in his voice caught Eleanor off guard. She looked down at the ring, at the way the sapphire caught the morning light, and felt the weight of history and expectation settle onto her finger. "Thank you," she whispered. I'll endeavor to honor it. Thomas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I know you will. They signed the register, Eleanor's hand only slightly unsteady as she wrote her new name for the first time. Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Ashford. The woman who'd signed that name felt like a stranger, someone Eleanor would need to grow into. The wedding breakfast at Ashford House was a small, awkward affair. The Dowager Duchess presided over the gathering with rigid politeness, clearly still processing her son's impulsive marriage. Eleanor's mother alternated between tears and nervous chatter. Her father looked relieved, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Thomas remained at Eleanor's side throughout, a solid, reassuring presence. He didn't touch her unnecessarily, but he was attentive, ensuring her glass was filled. Her plate had food she might actually want to eat, small courtesies that spoke of consideration. As the breakfast wound down, the Dowager Duchess approached Eleanor. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with Thomas's grey eyes and an expression that revealed nothing. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, curtsying. The Dowager studied her for a long moment, then surprised Eleanor by pulling her into a brief embrace. "My son is many things," she whispered, her lips close to Eleanor's ear. "Pragmatic, driven, occasionally too serious for his own good. But he is not impulsive. If he chose you, there is good reason. I trust his judgment, even if I don't fully understand it yet." She pulled back, her expression warming slightly. "Welcome to the family, Eleanor. I suspect you'll do very well." Eleanor felt an unexpected lump form in her throat. "Thank you. I'll try to be worthy of the name." "You already are, or Thomas wouldn't have married you." The Dowager patted her hand. "Now go. You have a long journey ahead, and my son is clearly anxious to depart." She was right. Thomas was already speaking with Henderson, his secretary, giving final instructions before their departure. Within the hour, they were settled in Thomas's well-appointed carriage, pulling away from Ashford House and heading toward the countryside. Eleanor watched London slip away through the carriage window, the familiar streets and buildings growing smaller, then disappearing entirely as they reached the city's edges. Everything she'd known, her entire life, was behind her now. Ahead lay Ashford Estate, a future she couldn't quite imagine, and a marriage that defied every expectation she'd once held. The silence in the carriage stretched, not quite comfortable but not unbearable either. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Are you comfortable? There's a blanket in the compartment if you're cold." "I'm well, thank you. When we arrive at Ashford Estate, I'll introduce you to Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, and Mr. Pemberton, the steward. They're both excellent at their positions and will help you acclimate." He paused. "My library is extensive. You're welcome to use it whenever you wish. And if there are any books you'd particularly like to acquire—" "That's very kind," Eleanor interrupted gently. She appreciated his practical focus. It was easier than navigating the emotional complexities of their situation. "I'm looking forward to seeing the estate." Thomas nodded, seeming relieved that she wasn't demanding reassurance or romantic declarations. They fell into a more companionable silence, broken occasionally by Thomas pointing out landmarks or Eleanor asking practical questions about the household. As the miles passed and the landscape transformed from urban sprawl to rolling countryside, Eleanor felt something settle inside her. She was Eleanor Ashford now, Duchess of Ashford. She had no idea yet who that woman would be, what kind of duchess she would become. But she would define herself on her own terms, just as she'd walked through that ballroom with her dignity intact. She would not be a duchess who simply wore the title. She would earn it. Thomas watched his new wife from the corner of his eye, noting the determination in the set of her jaw, the way she studied the passing landscape with keen attention rather than anxious fidgeting. Most women in her position would be either weeping or demanding constant reassurance. Eleanor was planning. Good, Thomas thought. They would need that practical determination for what lay ahead, navigating society's judgment, managing the estate, building a partnership from scratch. He'd chosen well. He was certain of it. Now they simply had to prove it to everyone else. Chapter 5. The partnership begins. Ashford Estate appeared through the carriage window like something from a painting, a sprawling manor of honey-coloured stone set against rolling green hills, with formal gardens stretching toward wooded parkland beyond. Eleanor pressed closer to the glass, taking in every detail. The house was grand without being ostentatious, beautifully maintained but practical in its elegance. It looked, she thought, exactly like what she was coming to understand of Thomas: substantial, well-managed, and entirely without pretense. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Thomas, who'd been watching her rather than the view, seemed pleased. "My great-grandfather built it in 1743. It's been expanded since, but carefully. I've tried to maintain the original character." The carriage swept up the circular drive, and Eleanor saw the household staff assembled on the front steps, a receiving line of servants waiting to meet their unexpected new duchess. Her stomach tightened with nerves. Thomas must have sensed her tension. "They're good people," he said. "Give them time to know you. They will." The housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, stood at the center of the line, a woman of perhaps 50 with iron-grey hair and a face that revealed nothing. She curtsied deeply as Eleanor descended from the carriage. "Your Grace, welcome to Ashford Estate." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway." Eleanor smiled, hoping it looked more confident than she felt. "I'm looking forward to learning from you. This is all rather new to me." Something flickered in Mrs. Holloway's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Of course, Your Grace, I'm at your service." The introductions continued down the line. Footmen, maids, the cook, the butler. Eleanor tried to remember names and faces, aware that these people would be watching her, judging whether their duke had made a terrible mistake. Thomas led her inside, and Eleanor's breath caught. The entrance hall soared 2 stories high, with a magnificent staircase sweeping upward and portraits of Ashford ancestors gazing down from panelled walls. But despite its grandeur, the space felt warm, fresh flowers on the console table, afternoon sun streaming through tall windows, the subtle scent of beeswax and lavender. "Come," Thomas said. "I'll show you the main rooms. Then you can rest before dinner." The tour was comprehensive: drawing rooms and sitting rooms, the ballroom with its crystal chandeliers, the dining room that could seat 40, the morning room where they would take breakfast. Thomas pointed out details, explained the history of various pieces, introduced her to more staff members they encountered. But it was the library that made Eleanor stop and stare. The room was enormous, 2 stories tall, with a gallery running around the upper level. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, thousands of them, their leather spines glowing in the afternoon light. A massive desk sat near the windows, and comfortable chairs were arranged near the fireplace. "You said I could use it," Eleanor said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "It's yours as much as mine." Thomas moved to one of the shelves, running his hand along the spines. "Philosophy is here, political economy in that section. The novels are upstairs in the gallery. If there's anything you'd like that we don't have, simply tell Henderson, and he'll acquire it." Eleanor walked slowly into the room, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and paper. For the first time since leaving London, she felt something in her chest loosen. "Thank you. This is wonderful." The next morning, Thomas surprised her at breakfast. "I have a meeting with Mr. Pemberton, my estate steward, at 10 o'clock. Would you like to attend? I thought you might find it interesting." Eleanor set down her teacup. "You want me to sit in on your business meeting? Why not? You'll need to understand how the estate operates." He spread jam on his toast with careful precision. "And frankly, another perspective is often valuable." So, at 10 o'clock, Eleanor found herself in Thomas's study with Mr. Pemberton, a capable-looking man in his 40s, who clearly hadn't expected the new Duchess to attend estate business meetings. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Eleanor with barely concealed uncertainty. "Mr. Pemberton, please, don't let my presence disrupt your usual routine." What followed was fascinating. Eleanor listened as Thomas and Mr. Pemberton discussed tenant concerns, crop rotations, drainage problems in the South Fields, repairs needed to several tenant cottages. The complexity of managing such a property was staggering. It was like running a small village, with Thomas responsible for the livelihoods of dozens of families. "And there's still the matter of the Grimshaw and Cooper dispute," Mr. Pemberton said, consulting his notes. "Both farmers claim rights to the water access on the boundary between their properties. It's been going on for months." Thomas frowned. "What are the specifics?" As Mr. Pemberton explained the situation, Eleanor found herself considering the problem. When he finished, both men looked thoughtful. "May I ask a question?" Eleanor ventured. Mr. Pemberton glanced at Thomas, who nodded. "Of course, Your Grace." "Is the water source adequate for both properties if properly managed?" "Well, yes, but then perhaps the solution isn't determining who has rights, but establishing a schedule. Each farmer gets access on alternating days or specific hours. That way neither feels cheated, and both benefit." Silence fell. Mr. Pemberton's eyebrows rose. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips. "That's actually quite sensible," Mr. Pemberton said slowly. "Why didn't I think of that?" "Sometimes an outside perspective helps," Thomas said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's with what looked like genuine respect. "Implement Her Grace's suggestion, Pemberton. I think it will work." Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Mornings began with breakfast together in the sunny morning room, where they discussed estate business and dissected articles from the newspapers Thomas had delivered from London. Eleanor discovered he had strong opinions on parliamentary reform and the ongoing wars with Napoleon, and he seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives. After breakfast, Eleanor would meet with Mrs. Holloway to learn about household management. The housekeeper had thawed considerably after Eleanor asked thoughtful questions rather than issuing imperious demands. The previous Duchess, His Grace's mother, was very particular about the linens, Mrs. Holloway explained one morning. She insisted on inspecting them personally each quarter. "That seems sensible," Eleanor said. "Would you show me the procedure? I want to maintain the household standards." Mrs. Holloway's expression warmed. "Of course, Your Grace. I'm pleased you take an interest." Afternoons varied. Sometimes Eleanor explored the estate on her own. Sometimes Thomas invited her to accompany him on his rounds. Once, they reviewed the household accounts together, and Eleanor discovered several inefficiencies in how supplies were ordered. "If we purchased flour and sugar in larger quantities directly from these suppliers," she said, pointing to figures in the ledger, "we'd save nearly £20 per quarter, and we could use those savings to increase wages for the lower staff. I've noticed the scullery maids are paid quite poorly." Mr. Pemberton, who'd been called in to discuss the accounts, looked skeptical. "That's not how we've traditionally done things, Your Grace. Perhaps that's why it should be reconsidered," Eleanor said mildly. Thomas studied the figures, then nodded. "Implement Her Grace's suggestions, Pemberton. All of them, including the wage increases." After Mr. Pemberton left, Thomas turned to Eleanor. "You see what I meant about needing a partner, not an ornament." Dinners were longer affairs, with conversations ranging from philosophy to politics to books they were reading. Thomas had strong opinions, but listened to Eleanor's counter-arguments with genuine attention. She found herself looking forward to these intellectual sparring matches. Evenings they often spent in the library, sitting in comfortable chairs near the fireplace, both reading. Sometimes hours would pass in companionable silence, broken only when one of them wanted to share a passage or thought. Small kindnesses accumulated like interest on an investment. Eleanor mentioned once that she preferred her tea prepared with milk added first, and within days it arrived that way every morning without her having to ask. When Thomas showed her the rose garden, she admired the white climbing roses particularly. "My mother planted those," Thomas said. "She always said white roses represented new beginnings." Eleanor touched one of the soft petals. "They're lovely." The next day, she found a vase of white roses in her bedchamber. For her part, Eleanor noticed that Thomas had a tendency to work too late, skipping meals when deeply focused on estate, business, or correspondence. She began bringing him food to his study sandwiches, fruit, tea, placing the tray on his desk without comment. The first time, he looked up in surprise. "You didn't need to do this. You need to eat," Eleanor said simply, "and you won't if someone doesn't remind you." After that, it became routine. Thomas would look up from his work to find sustenance appearing as if by magic, and Eleanor would receive a quiet "thank you" that felt like something more. One afternoon, they walked through the estate gardens together, Thomas explaining the history of various plantings. His knowledge was impressive. He could identify every tree, every shrub, and recount when and why they'd been planted. "My grandfather was passionate about horticulture," Thomas said, stopping before a particularly beautiful arrangement of flowering shrubs. "He believed that beauty served a purpose beyond mere decoration. It reminded people that civilization could create something lasting and worthwhile." Eleanor looked at him with new understanding. Thomas wasn't just wealthy, he genuinely appreciated beauty, history, the weight of stewardship. "That's a lovely philosophy. I've tried to maintain it." He glanced at her. "Beauty and utility needn't be separate things. The best solutions serve both purposes." Was he talking about gardens or about their marriage? Eleanor couldn't be certain. Physical boundaries remained carefully maintained. They occupied separate bedchambers at opposite ends of the family wing. Thomas never touched her beyond what was necessary. His arm offered for walks, his hand at her elbow when helping her into the carriage. Yet somehow the lack of physical intimacy didn't feel cold. It felt respectful, patient, as though they were building something that required a proper foundation first. One evening, Eleanor mentioned that she missed music. She'd played the pianoforte at home, but hadn't touched an instrument since the financial collapse. "There's a pianoforte in the music room," Thomas said. "Do you play?" "I used to. Nothing virtuosic, but I enjoyed it." The next day, Eleanor discovered that Thomas had sent for a tuner from the nearest town. The pianoforte had been perfectly maintained, its tone rich and clear when she finally sat down to play. In her private journal that night, Eleanor wrote, "This strange marriage feels less like a cage than I feared. Thomas treats me as he would a business partner. He genuinely respects, asking my opinions, trusting my judgment, sharing his world with me. Is that enough? I thought I knew what I wanted from marriage, passion, romance, declarations of love. Now I'm not certain what this is becoming, but it feels solid in a way my engagement to Edward never did." At the end of their third week at Ashford Estate, Eleanor had spent the day implementing her household reforms with Mrs. Holloway's assistance. The staff seemed pleased with the changes, particularly the wage increases. As evening fell, Eleanor found Thomas in his study, reviewing correspondence. "The new supply arrangements are working well," she said. "Mrs. Holloway is pleased." Thomas set down his pen and looked at her. "Thank you for taking such care with the household. You've done more in 3 weeks than most duchesses accomplish in 3 years. You trusted me with real responsibility. That made the difference." "Trust is earned, Eleanor." His use of her first name, still rare and deliberate, made her breath catch slightly. "You've earned it." The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Then Thomas cleared his throat and returned to his correspondence. But as Eleanor left the study, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with belonging. That night, Thomas sat alone in the library, thinking about the woman who'd become his wife. She was everything he'd hoped for: intelligent, capable, thoughtful, but she was also becoming something he hadn't expected: essential. In 1 month, they would need to return to London for the remainder of the season. They would face society's judgment together, navigate the gossip and speculation, prove that their unconventional marriage was more than just scandal. Thomas found he was almost looking forward to it. With Eleanor at his side, society's opinions suddenly mattered much less than they once had. Chapter 6. Society's Judgment. The return to London felt like stepping back into a lion's den. Eleanor watched the familiar streets roll past the carriage window, busier, noisier, more oppressive than she remembered. After 3 peaceful weeks at Ashford Estate, the city felt like a different world entirely. "We don't have to do this yet," Thomas said quietly from across the carriage. "We could return to the country for another month." Eleanor turned from the window. "Running away won't silence the gossip. Better to face it directly." Thomas's expression held something that might have been admiration. "Most women in your position would prefer to hide." "I'm not most women." Eleanor adjusted her gloves, a gesture she'd come to recognize as her way of steadying herself. "And besides, hiding would only confirm whatever scandalous stories they've invented about us." They had, Eleanor knew, invented quite a few. Letters from her mother, now comfortably settled in better lodgings, thanks to Thomas's discreet financial assistance, had kept her apprised of the gossip circulating through London's drawing rooms. "They say you trapped him somehow, that you must be with child, another man's child, that the Duke has gone mad with grief over ending his betrothal to Lady Vivienne, that your family blackmailed him with some terrible secret." The creativity of society's speculation would have been impressive if it weren't so malicious. Ashford House, the Duke's London residence, was an elegant townhouse in Mayfair, smaller than the country estate but no less impressive. The staff here were equally professional, equally uncertain about their unexpected new duchess. Eleanor felt the weight of their assessment as Thomas introduced her to the household. That evening, as Eleanor dressed for Lady Pemberton's ball, their first major social appearance, Thomas came to her sitting room. He stopped in the doorway, and Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes as he took in her appearance. She'd chosen carefully, a deep rose gown that brought colour to her cheeks, cut in the latest fashion with a modest but elegant neckline, and around her throat the Ashford diamonds, a magnificent necklace that caught the candlelight and proclaimed her status more clearly than words ever could. "You look every inch a duchess," Thomas said. "That's rather the point." Eleanor touched the necklace. "I'm claiming my place. Let them whisper." Thomas moved into the room, his expression growing serious. "There are some people you should be prepared to encounter tonight. Lady Jersey controls access to Almack's Her Opinion Matters. The Duchess of Marlborough is society's unofficial arbiter of acceptability. And," he paused, "Lady Vivian Blackwood will likely be there." Eleanor had been waiting for Vivian's name. "Your former betrothed?" "Yes." Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. "She was. Displeased when I ended our engagement. I suspect she'll want to take your measure." "I imagine she'll want to do more than that." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I'm prepared, Thomas. I survived Edward's cruelty in front of half of London. I can certainly survive Lady Vivian's displeasure." The ballroom at Lady Pemberton's was already crowded when they arrived. The announcement of their arrival, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, caused a ripple effect through the assembled guests. Conversations didn't stop entirely, but they paused, shifted, refocused. Eleanor felt dozens of eyes turn toward them, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity like a physical pressure. Thomas kept her hand firmly on his arm, his posture protective without being obvious. They moved into the room together, and Eleanor held her head high, meeting curious gazes with calm acknowledgement. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton swept toward them, all smiles and enthusiasm. "How delightful that you could attend. And your new Duchess, my dear, you look absolutely splendid." The greeting was warm, but Eleanor noticed the avid curiosity in Lady Pemberton's eyes. This would be a story to dine out on for weeks. They'd been in the ballroom perhaps 20 minutes, long enough for Eleanor to be introduced to several important matrons and to feel the beginning of tension in her shoulders when Lady Vivian Blackwood made her entrance. Eleanor understood immediately why Thomas had been betrothed to her. Vivienne was stunning golden hair arranged in artful curls, sapphire eyes that sparkled with intelligence and something sharper, and a gown of ice-blue silk that must have cost a fortune. She wore sapphires at her throat that made Eleanor's diamonds look almost modest by comparison. Every other woman in the room looked slightly underdressed by comparison. Vivian's gaze swept the ballroom and landed on Thomas with unerring accuracy. Her smile was brilliant, perfect, and utterly false. She approached with the confidence of a woman who'd never been denied anything. "Your Grace," she said to Thomas, her voice carrying just far enough to attract attention. "How unexpected to see you here, and with your new Duchess." She turned to Eleanor, and her smile sharpened. "How quaint that you've chosen to honor us with your presence so soon after your marriage." The pause before marriage was deliberate, laden with implications Eleanor couldn't quite decipher but understood were insulting. "Lady Vivienne." Thomas's voice was cool, formal. "May I present my wife, Eleanor, Duchess of Ashford. Eleanor, Lady Vivian Blackwood." Vivian's curtsy was perfect, her smile never wavering. "Miss Hartley, pardon me. Your Grace, I do hope you're adjusting to your new responsibilities. Managing a ducal household is so different from—" she paused delicately, "whatever it was you did before." The insult was wrapped in silk, but it was still an insult. Around them, several people had stopped pretending not to listen. Eleanor smiled, matching Vivian's tone exactly. "Lady Vivian, how kind of you to be concerned. I'm finding the adjustment quite natural, actually. The Duke has been remarkably helpful in explaining anything I might not have known." She leaned slightly closer, as though sharing a confidence. "He's very thorough in his instruction." The subtle implication that Thomas had been teaching her things of an intimate nature hung in the air for just a moment. Thomas's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Eleanor's arm, though whether in warning or approval, she couldn't tell. Vivian's smile froze, then tightened. "How? Fortunate for you. Indeed, I consider myself remarkably fortunate." Eleanor's voice carried just enough warmth to sound sincere, just enough steel to make her point clear. "If you'll excuse us, Lady Vivienne, I believe the Duke promised me this dance." As Thomas led her onto the dance floor, Eleanor felt her heart pounding. Had she gone too far? Been too bold? "That was expertly done," Thomas murmured as they began to waltz. "Vivienne isn't accustomed to being outmaneuvered. I hope I didn't embarrass you." "Embarrass me?" Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "You're handling their petty cruelty remarkably well. Better than I dared hope." Eleanor met his eyes. "Did you expect me to crumble? I survived Edward's public rejection in front of half these people. These small cuts are nothing by comparison." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Respect, certainly, but also something warmer. "Most women raised to this life couldn't have endured what you did. You're stronger than they'll ever understand." The dance continued, and Eleanor tried to focus on the steps rather than the whispers she could feel rippling around them. Throughout the evening, similar encounters repeated polite greetings laced with subtle insults, references to her unexpected good fortune, questions about how she was managing such responsibility. Lady Morton asked, with false sweetness, whether Eleanor found the household accounts terribly confusing. Lady Ashworth wondered aloud how Eleanor was coping with the demands of her new position. Lord Wetherby made a joke about fortune hunters that wasn't quite direct enough to be openly offensive, but was clearly meant for Eleanor's ears. She handled each interaction with grace, refusing to be baited, refusing to show hurt or anger. Thomas remained at her side throughout, a solid, reassuring presence. Later in the evening, Eleanor excused herself to the ladies' retiring room, needing a moment of respite from the constant scrutiny. She was repairing a loose pin in her hair when two ladies entered, clearly not realizing Eleanor was behind the screen in the corner. "Did you see her diamonds?" one voice said. Lady Hartwell, Eleanor thought. She's certainly making the most of her new position. "Can you blame her?" The second voice belonged to Miss Catherine Winters. "She went from pauper to duchess in a matter of weeks. It's extraordinary, really. Extraordinary or suspicious. Everyone knows the Duke was devoted to Lady Vivienne. This marriage makes no sense. Perhaps he felt sorry for her, or perhaps she trapped him somehow. You know how desperate women can be. Whatever the reason, it won't last. The Duke will tire of his charity case soon enough. Men always do." Eleanor stood frozen behind the screen, each word landing like a blow. She waited until they left, then emerged, her reflection in the mirror showing nothing of the hurt churning inside her. She stepped into the corridor and found Thomas waiting there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His expression told her he'd known exactly what she would overhear. "You were waiting for me," Eleanor said quietly. "I had a feeling you might need." He trailed off, then straightened. "Are you all right?" Eleanor considered lying, then remembered his insistence on honesty between them. "No, but I will be." They said nothing more until they were in the carriage heading home, the sounds of the ball fading behind them. Eleanor stared out the window, watching London's streets pass in the darkness. "I despise this," Thomas said suddenly. "Society's superficiality, their cruel entertainment at others' expense. It's one of the reasons I—" He stopped. "One of the reasons you what?" Eleanor turned to look at him. "One of the reasons I married you." Thomas met her gaze directly. "I couldn't face a lifetime of this with Vivienne, the performances, the calculations, the complete lack of genuine connection. She wanted the title, the position, the political advantages. She never wanted me." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. "And you think I'm different? I know you are. You didn't want any of this. You accepted it because circumstances forced your hand. But you've approached it with honesty and genuine effort. You're not performing, Eleanor. You're simply being yourself. That's remarkably rare in this world." "I married you to survive," Eleanor said quietly. "That's hardly noble. No, but you could have played the role badly, could have been bitter or resentful or grasping. Instead, you've been—" Thomas searched for words— "a true partner. You've contributed genuine value to the estate management. You've treated the staff with respect. You've faced society's cruelty with more grace than they deserve." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "I don't regret this marriage," she said, "which surprises me more than I can say. I thought I'd spend my life resenting the practical arrangement that trapped me. But I don't. I'm grateful. Grateful it was you, and not someone who would have treated me as property or a burden." Thomas reached across the carriage and took her hand, not romantically, but in solidarity. His grip was warm, firm, grounding. "Whatever they say, whatever gossip they spread, we know the truth," he said. "This marriage is built on honesty and mutual respect. That's more than most of them can claim." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, feeling the walls she'd carefully maintained around her heart beginning to lower. Was that wise? Was it safe to feel more than practical partnership with a man who'd been clear about offering respect, but not love? She didn't know. But sitting in the darkness of the carriage, her hand in Thomas's, Eleanor realized she was willing to find out. "Thank you," she whispered, "for defending me, for believing in me. Always," Thomas said simply. And Eleanor believed him. Chapter 7. Vivienne's Campaign. Lady Vivienne Blackwood stood before her dressing table mirror, studying her reflection with the critical eye of a general surveying a battlefield. She was beautiful, she'd always known that. had wielded her beauty like a weapon since her debut 7 years ago. Golden hair, sapphire eyes, flawless skin, a figure that made dressmakers weep with joy. But beauty, she was learning, wasn't always enough. Thomas, the Duke she'd been promised since she was 18, had married a nobody. A woman with brown hair and grey eyes, and no fortune, no connections, nothing that mattered. Eleanor Hartley had been publicly rejected by a viscount, and somehow that had made her worthy of a duke. It was incomprehensible, intolerable, and Vivienne intended to correct it. Lady Hertford's garden party was the perfect venue to begin. The weather was fine, the gathering intimate enough for whispers to carry, but large enough for them to spread. Vivienne positioned herself near the Duchess of Marlborough Society's unofficial arbiter of acceptability and waited for the right moment. "I saw the Duke at his club last week," Vivienne said to Lord Pemberton, her voice pitched to carry. "He looked so troubled, poor man. Quite distant, really. Not himself at all." The Duchess of Marlborough's head turned slightly, listening, though pretending not to. "Perhaps the adjustment has been difficult," Vivienne continued, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I do hope he hasn't rushed into something he'll regret. These hasty marriages so rarely work out well." "Lady Vivienne," Lord Pemberton said uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the trap. "I'm sure the Duke is quite content." "Oh, of course," Vivienne said quickly. "I'm being silly. It's just, well, one worries about old friends, doesn't one?" The seed was planted. By evening, half of London would have heard that the Duke looked troubled, that his hasty marriage was perhaps not the love match some had generously assumed. 3 days later, at the theatre, Vivienne executed the second phase of her campaign. She'd learned through careful inquiry which box the Ashfords had reserved and had arranged at considerable expense to secure the adjacent box. When Thomas and Eleanor arrived, Vivienne was already seated, looking radiant in ivory silk. She waited until the interval, then leaned toward their box. "Your Grace," she called warmly. "Thomas, darling, do you remember when we attended the Merchant of Venice here? You laughed so hard at that dreadful actor playing Shylock that you nearly fell from your chair." Thomas's expression remained polite but distant. "I remember the play, yes. We had such wonderful times," Vivienne continued, her voice carrying to nearby boxes. "Do you recall the night we—" She stopped, as though catching herself. "But I mustn't bore your new Duchess with old stories." Eleanor, Vivienne noted with satisfaction, had gone very still. Over the following days, Vivienne continued her careful campaign. A comment here about how the Duke seemed changed, a sympathetic look there for poor Eleanor, who must be struggling with such responsibilities. Nothing overt enough to be called out, but persistent enough to create doubt. She watched the gossip spread like ripples in a pond. Ladies began regarding Eleanor with pity. Whispers followed the new Duchess of Ashford through drawing rooms and ballrooms. Vivienne heard snatches of conversation. "The Duke does seem rather strained lately. One wonders if he's regretting his impulse. Poor Lady Vivienne, losing him to such an unsuitable match." Perfect, Eleanor, meanwhile, had sought refuge in the British Museum. After 2 weeks of constant social scrutiny, she needed an afternoon away from pitying glances and veiled insults. She was studying a Roman marble when a familiar voice made her stomach clench. "Eleanor? Good gracious, is that you?" She turned to find Edward Beaumont approaching with a young woman on his arm, his new wife, presumably. Lady Catherine was pretty in an insipid way, with blonde ringlets and a rosebud mouth that seemed permanently set in a vapid smile. "Edward," Eleanor's voice was cool. "Lady Catherine, how pleasant to see you." Edward looked genuinely shocked. "I heard you'd married the Duke of Ashford, but I confess I didn't quite believe it." "How? Extraordinary." "Is it?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "I suppose different people find different things extraordinary." "My dear Eleanor," Edward caught himself. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I hope you're finding your new position manageable. It must be quite overwhelming, given your lack of, that is to say, your previous circumstances." Eleanor smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. "Not at all overwhelming, Edward. The Duke has been an excellent teacher, and I've discovered I have quite an aptitude for estate management. But how kind of you to be concerned." She turned to Lady Catherine. "And congratulations on your own marriage, Lady Catherine. I'm sure you and Edward will be very happy." The pause before "very happy" carried just enough weight to make her meaning clear. As happy as money could buy. Edward's face flushed. "Yes, well, we should be going. Catherine wanted to see the Egyptian collection." As they walked away, Eleanor heard Catherine's high-pitched voice. "Edward, darling, who was that woman?" "No one important," Edward replied, his voice tight. Eleanor returned to Ashford House feeling strangely vindicated, but the satisfaction faded when she entered the drawing room to find a massive bouquet of white roses waiting. The card, written in elegant script, read, "Welcome to the Duke's life. I do hope you'll find your place in it. V." The cruelty was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor stood staring at the flowers, feeling something inside her begin to crack. That evening, when Thomas returned from a political dinner, Eleanor was waiting in his study. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, "about Lady Vivienne." Thomas set down his papers, his expression wary. "What about her? What was your relationship? Truly?" Eleanor moved closer. "You said it was an arrangement, but she acts as though you were lovers. She speaks of shared memories, intimate moments. Were you?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Our families arranged the betrothal when we were both young. I was 23, she was 18. We were expected to marry eventually, once I'd secured the dukedom's finances. But Eleanor, there was never genuine affection between us. I respected Vivienne as one respects a business associate. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything society said I should want. But every conversation felt hollow. She wanted the title, the position, the political connections. I wanted," he paused, meeting Eleanor's eyes, "I wanted what you and I are building, something real." Eleanor studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. "She's working to undermine me. You realize that?" "I do." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "And I apologize for not anticipating how she'd react. Vivienne doesn't accept losing. She never has." Eleanor felt something shift inside her, not doubt, but resolve. "Then I'll stop being passive. If I'm to be the Duchess of Ashford, I'll claim that position properly, not just in name, but in truth." "What do you mean?" "I'm going to host a charity musicale, here, at Ashford House. I'll invite everyone who matters, the Duchess of Marlborough, Lady Jersey, all the women whose opinions shape society, and I'll show them exactly who I am." Thomas looked at her with something approaching awe. "That's brilliant." "It's necessary." Eleanor's voice was firm. "Vivienne wants to make me look small, uncertain, unworthy. I'm going to prove otherwise." The preparations consumed the next week. Eleanor personally wrote invitations to 50 of London's most influential figures, carefully researching each guest's interests and charitable causes. She enlisted Mrs. Holloway from the country estate to help coordinate with the London household staff. And she sent an urgent letter to the Dowager Duchess, requesting her presence and support. Thomas's mother arrived 2 days before the musicale, sweeping into Ashford House with the quiet authority of someone born to command. "Show me your plans," she said to Eleanor without preamble. Eleanor spread out her notes, guest lists, seating arrangements, musical program, carefully planned conversations for each key attendee. The Dowager studied them, then looked at Eleanor with approval. "You've thought of everything. Good. These women respect competence and intelligence. Show them both, and you'll have them." The night of the musicale, Ashford House glowed with candlelight and flowers. Eleanor had chosen white roses, taking Vivienne's subtle insult and transforming it into something beautiful. Musicians were positioned in the music room, refreshments arranged in the drawing room, every detail perfect. Eleanor wore deep blue silk, the Ashford diamonds at her throat, and a confidence she'd built from careful preparation rather than false bravado. The guests arrived in a steady stream. Eleanor greeted each personally, engaging them with the knowledge she'd carefully acquired about their interests. To Lord Ashcroft, who'd written extensively on parliamentary reform, "Your Grace, I found your recent article on electoral constituencies fascinating. The proposal for redistricting based on population rather than tradition seems both radical and necessary." Lord Ashcroft's eyebrows rose. "You read political theory, Your Grace? When it's as well argued as yours, yes." To Lady Morton, known for her patronage of artists, "I understand you're supporting the new exhibition at Somerset House. The landscapes sound extraordinary, particularly the Scottish Highlands series." Lady Morton beamed. "You appreciate art, Your Grace? I'm learning to. The Duke has been educating me on the principles of composition and light." To the Duchess of Marlborough, whose charitable work was legendary, "Your Grace, I've been considering how to use my position meaningfully. I'd be honored to discuss your work with foundling hospitals. I'd like to establish something similar in the Ashford estate villages. The Duchess's expression warmed. We should speak further, my dear. I think we could accomplish much together. Throughout the evening, Eleanor moved through her guests with genuine warmth and intelligence. She wasn't performing, she was simply being herself, engaged and interested in the people around her. Lady Jersey, standing near the refreshment table, remarked to Lady Pemberton, "The new Duchess is quite impressive, so much more substantial than one expected." Vivienne arrived fashionably late, dressed in silver silk that caught every eye. She swept through the room looking for fault, for any weakness she could exploit. But Eleanor had left no openings. The house was beautifully arranged. The guests were engaged and enjoying themselves, and Eleanor moved through them all with the grace of someone completely comfortable in her role. During the musical performance, Thomas found Eleanor briefly alone in an alcove near the music room. "You're extraordinary," he said quietly. "You've won them over completely." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not trying to win anyone over. I'm simply being myself and doing what needs to be done." Thomas looked at her with an expression that made Eleanor's breath catch not just admiration, but something deeper, more vulnerable. "That's exactly why you're succeeding." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Eleanor felt the air between them charge with possibility. Then a guest approached, and the moment passed. But as Eleanor returned to her hosting duties, she was acutely aware of Thomas watching her from across the room, his expression thoughtful. Later, as the last guests departed, Vivienne was among them. She found Eleanor near the door and leaned close. "Enjoy your triumph," Vivienne said softly. "But remember, I was part of his life for 10 years. You've been here for weeks. That kind of history doesn't simply disappear." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "You're right. History doesn't disappear, but neither does it define the future. Good evening, Lady Vivienne." As Vivienne's carriage pulled away, Eleanor felt Thomas's presence behind her. "She won't stop," Eleanor said quietly. "No," Thomas agreed, "but neither will we." Eleanor turned to look at him and found something in his expression that made her heart race. They were partners, yes, but somewhere in the battles of the past weeks, they'd become something more. She just wasn't certain either of them was ready to acknowledge it yet. Chapter 8. Cracks in the Armour. Lord Edward Beaumont could not stop thinking about Eleanor Hartley, or rather, Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Ashford, a title that should have been laughable, but instead made his chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to regret. He'd encountered her at the British Museum 3 weeks ago, and the memory festered like a wound that wouldn't heal. She'd looked at him with cool dismissal, as though he were barely worth her notice. She'd wished him happiness with Catherine in a tone that suggested she knew exactly how hollow that happiness was. And worst of all, she'd looked entirely comfortable in her new position, no trace of the desperate woman he'd rejected, no hint that she remembered being publicly humiliated. Edward took a long drink of brandy and surveyed the gentlemen gathered in his club. Lord Wetherby and Sir James Thornton sat nearby, and Edward saw his opportunity. "Amazing what some women will do when desperate," he said, just loud enough to be overheard. "Though I suppose Ashford needed someone to manage his household. That's all it really is, isn't it? A practical arrangement." "You're speaking of the new Duchess?" Lord Wetherby asked. "Who else?" "The woman went from pauper to Duchess in a matter of weeks. One must wonder what inducements were offered." Edward let the implication hang in the air. Ashford was always odd, preferring his account books to society. I suppose he wanted someone equally practical. Sir James looked uncomfortable. "The Duke seems content with his choice." "Does he?" Edward leaned forward. "Or is he simply making the best of an impulsive decision? I knew the girl Miss Hartley, as she was. Clever enough, I'll grant, but hardly Duchess material. Ashford married her out of pity. Mark my words. He'll tire of his charity case eventually." The seeds planted at his club spread through London's drawing rooms with predictable efficiency. Within days, Eleanor heard echoes of Edward's campaign, always second-hand, always deniable, but persistent enough to sting. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Something Eleanor found both exhilarating and terrifying. Her relationship with Thomas was changing. Their conversations, once focused on practical matters, had grown longer and more personal. Thomas sought her counsel on political decisions, asking her perspective on parliamentary bills and foreign policy. When reviewing business investments together, their heads bent close over documents, Eleanor became acutely aware of how their hands would brush, how Thomas's fingers would linger against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. During evening reading in the library, They sat closer now, not touching, but near enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth of Thomas's presence. When he escorted her at social events, his hand at the small of her back felt less like courtesy and more like possession wasn't quite right. Protection, perhaps, or claiming. Neither acknowledged these changes explicitly, but Eleanor felt them like a current running beneath every interaction. The air between them had become charged with possibility, with questions neither seemed ready to ask. Then came the day when everything became too much. It started with Lady Pemberton, who pulled Eleanor aside at a morning call with breathless concern. "My dear Duchess, I felt you should know Lord Beaumont has been saying the most dreadful things, suggesting your marriage was purely mercenary, that the Duke acted from pity. I'm sure it's all nonsense, but—" Eleanor smiled and assured Lady Pemberton that she paid no attention to gossip, but the words burrowed under her skin like splinters. Then the afternoon post brought a letter from her father, his handwriting shaky with distress. Despite Thomas's generous assistance, some creditors were still pursuing the family, threatening legal action over debts Eleanor's father had thought settled. The shame and worry in his words made Eleanor's throat tight. By evening, the weight of maintaining perfect composure while navigating society's endless cruelty had become unbearable. Eleanor retreated to the library, pulling a book from the shelf without really seeing it. She sat in her usual chair and stared at the pages, the words blurring into meaninglessness. That's where Thomas found her when he returned from Parliament, sitting motionless, a book open in her lap, her expression distant and lost. He stopped in the doorway, and Eleanor felt his gaze on her like a physical touch. "Eleanor," his voice was gentle. "What's happened?" She tried to summon her usual composure, to wave away his concern with a bright smile and easy reassurance, but something in his expression, genuine worry, without judgment, broke through her defenses. "I'm tired, Thomas." The words came out quietly, almost a whisper. "I'm tired of proving myself, tired of their judgment, tired of feeling like I'm one mistake away from confirming every terrible thing they think about me. I'm tired of Edward spreading rumors that our marriage is a sham, tired of Vivienne's subtle cruelties, tired of ladies who smile to my face while pitying me behind their fans." Her voice cracked slightly. "I'm tired of feeling like I'm not enough." Thomas crossed the room and sat beside her, close, but not crowding. His presence was solid, grounding. "You're one of the strongest people I've known," he said quietly. "But strength doesn't mean bearing everything alone, Eleanor." She looked at him, and something in his expression made her eyes burn with unshed tears. Thomas continued, his voice low. "When I inherited the dukedom, I was drowning in my father's debts. There were days, many days, when I wanted to give up, to let the creditors have it all, to walk away and let the whole thing collapse. The weight of it felt impossible." Eleanor had never heard him speak of those years with such honesty. "But I didn't give up," Thomas said. "Not because I never felt the weight, but because I refused to let it break me. You have that same refusal in you, Eleanor. I've watched you face things that would have destroyed most people, and you've done it with grace and dignity. You're not weak for feeling tired. You're human." "What if I'm not enough?" Eleanor heard herself ask, vulnerability stripping away her usual careful control. "Not for this role, not for—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Not for you." Thomas's hand covered hers on the arm of the chair. His touch was warm, steady. "You are more than enough," he said with quiet intensity. "You've exceeded every expectation, mine, society's, even your own. Eleanor, this marriage began as a practical arrangement. I was honest about that. But you—" He paused, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression walls coming down, revealing emotion he usually kept carefully hidden. "You've become essential to me, not as a duchess, not as a household manager or a social asset, as a partner, as someone whose presence I've come to value more than I knew I could." Eleanor's breath caught. She turned toward him and found his face very close to hers. His grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Thomas, you make me want to be home," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "When I'm at Parliament or attending to business, I find myself thinking about our conversations, about sharing something interesting I've learned with you. When something amusing happens, you're the person I want to tell. When something troubles me, you're the one whose counsel I seek." They were sitting very close now, his hand still covering hers, their foreheads nearly touching. Eleanor could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes. The air between them charged with something unspoken, not just respect or friendship, but something deeper, more vulnerable, something that felt like falling. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, and Thomas did the same. The distance between them narrowed to nothing, breath mingling, lips almost touching. Thomas pulled back, just slightly. "I don't want to take advantage of your upset," he said, his voice strained. "You're vulnerable right now, and I won't." "You couldn't take advantage," Eleanor interrupted softly. "You've never once taken advantage, Thomas. Not when you proposed, not during our marriage, not now." But the moment had shifted. Thomas stood, putting careful distance between them, and Eleanor felt the loss like a physical ache. "Your father's letter," Thomas said, clearly trying to regain equilibrium. "What did it say?" Eleanor explained the situation with the remaining creditors. Thomas's expression grew determined. "I'll handle it. Tomorrow, I'll have Henderson contact your father's solicitor and settle everything completely and permanently. Your family shouldn't be suffering. You've already been so generous." "Eleanor." Thomas turned back to her, his expression intense. "Why do you think I care so much about your family's situation?" She shook her head, unable to answer. "Because their dignity matters to you," Thomas said simply. "And what matters to you matters to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor stood, moving closer but not touching. "Thomas, what is happening between us?" He looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw the careful control he usually maintained, warring with something else, something raw and honest. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't want it to stop." They stood there in the lamplight, the library silent around them, both aware that something fundamental had shifted. Thomas reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We don't have to define this tonight," he said quietly. "We can simply let it be." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with emotion. They stood together, hands joined, neither quite willing to break the connection. The silence was comfortable, laden with possibility. Finally, reluctantly, Eleanor withdrew her hand. It's late." "Yes." Thomas's voice was rough. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night." Eleanor made her way to her bedchamber, her mind whirling. She changed into her nightdress mechanically, dismissed her maid, and lay in bed staring at the canopy above. The evening played through her mind on endless repeat. Thomas's words, "You've become essential to me." His expression, when he'd pulled back from kissing her, not rejection, but restraint, his hand in hers, warm and steady. "What matters to you matters to me." Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, feeling the truth she'd been avoiding crash over her like a wave. She was falling in love with her own husband, not the practical partnership she'd agreed to, not the respectful arrangement they'd negotiated, but actual, terrifying, inconvenient love, the kind that made her chest ache when he smiled, that made her seek his presence like a compass seeking north, that made the thought of him not feeling the same absolutely devastating. How unexpected, she thought, laughing quietly into the darkness. How terrifying, how utterly inconvenient, when I don't know if he feels the same, or if this partnership is all he wants. But lying there in the dark, replaying every word and gesture, Eleanor couldn't help but hope. Thomas had pulled away not from lack of desire, but from not wanting to take advantage. He'd said she was essential. He'd shared vulnerabilities he'd kept hidden. That had to mean something, didn't it? Eleanor turned onto her side, watching moonlight pattern the walls, and wondered if Thomas was lying awake in his own bedchamber, wrestling with the same questions. She hoped he was. She hoped she wasn't alone in this terrifying, wonderful falling. Chapter 9. The Vindication. Eleanor stood before the full-length mirror in her dressing room, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The emerald silk gown hugged her figure before flowing in elegant lines to the floor, the color bringing out depths in her grey eyes she'd never noticed before. But it was the Ashford parure that truly transformed her, the full set of emeralds and diamonds that generations of duchesses had worn. The necklace sat heavy at her throat, matching earrings caught the candlelight, a delicate bracelet encircled her wrist, and the tiara. The tiara made her look like royalty. 3 months ago, she'd been a ruined woman with no prospects. Now she looked like someone who belonged in ballrooms, someone whose opinion mattered, someone who could command respect with a single glance. "Your Grace?" Her maid's voice was tentative. "Will that be all?" Eleanor turned from the mirror. "Yes, thank you, Mary." Alone, Eleanor took a steadying breath. Tonight was the Duchess of Marlborough's grand ball, the pinnacle of the social season. Every important figure in London would attend. It would be the ultimate test of whether she'd truly been accepted, or whether society still viewed her as the pauper who'd somehow trapped a duke. The knock at her door made her pulse quicken. "Come in." Thomas entered and stopped dead in the doorway, his expression transforming from polite greeting to something that made Eleanor's breath catch. "You're stunning," he said, his voice slightly rough. Eleanor tried to maintain composure. "I'm well dressed. There's a difference." Thomas moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "No, you're stunning. The dress is incidental." The air between them grew charged. Since that evening in the library 2 weeks ago, since the almost kiss, since his confession that she'd become essential to him, everything had changed. They orbited each other now with careful awareness, both knowing something profound was building between them, but uncertain how to acknowledge it. Eleanor wanted to close the distance, to finally ask the questions that kept her awake at night. But Thomas was already offering his arm. "We should go," he said quietly. "Before I forget, we have obligations, and convince you to stay home." The comment was so unexpected, so unlike his usual careful formality, that Eleanor laughed. The sound broke the tension, and they headed downstairs together. The Duchess of Marlborough's ballroom was the finest in London, massive chandeliers dripping with crystals, walls hung with silk, an orchestra positioned on a raised dais. When the major domo announced them, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, every head in the room turned. But this time, Eleanor noticed the difference. She'd learned to read the subtle signals of society's approval. Where once she'd seen pity and schadenfreude, now she saw respect. Curiosity, certainly, even envy from some quarters, but no longer judgment. The Duchess of Marlborough swept toward them immediately, her greeting warm and genuine. "Your Graces, how delightful. Eleanor, my dear, I've been hoping to speak with you about your charity initiative. Lady Morton tells me you're establishing a school?" "On the Ashford estate, yes," Eleanor said. "We're starting with the tenant children, teaching them reading and basic mathematics." "Excellent. We must coordinate our efforts." The Duchess squeezed Eleanor's hand. "I'm so pleased to see women of substance using their positions meaningfully." As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself genuinely engaged in conversations rather than merely enduring them. Lady Jersey discussed political reform with surprising passion. Lord Ashcroft sought her opinion on agricultural improvements. Several younger ladies asked her advice on household management. She was no longer the spectacle. She was simply part of society. Thomas watched her from across the room, his expression holding pride and something warmer. Every time their eyes met, Eleanor felt that charge of awareness, that question of what they were becoming to each other. Then Lord Edward Beaumont arrived. Eleanor noticed him immediately, partly because Lady Catherine looked mortified, trying to guide her husband away from the refreshment table where he'd clearly already had too much wine, and partly because Edward's voice carried as he spoke to Mr. Winthrop. "Surprising marriages everywhere these days," Edward said loudly. "Social climbing dressed up as romance." Eleanor stiffened. Thomas, who'd been speaking with Lord Pemberton, went very still. Edward worked his way closer to where Eleanor stood with Lady Morton, his movements just slightly unsteady. "My dear Eleanor, pardon me, Your Grace." His tone made the title sound like mockery. "You've done quite well for yourself, haven't you?" Lady Morton's eyes widened. Around them, conversations began to pause. "Lord Beaumont," Eleanor said coolly, "I hope you're enjoying the evening." "Oh, immensely." Edward's smile was cruel. Who would have thought a pauper could land a duke? "Though I suppose everyone here knows the truth, it's merely a practical arrangement, isn't it? The Duke needed someone to manage his household, and you needed—" He paused meaningfully. "Everything." The ballroom didn't fall completely silent, but a circle of quiet spread outward from where they stood. Fans stopped fluttering. People turned to watch. Eleanor felt her face flush, but she kept her voice steady. "I think perhaps you've had too much wine, Lord Beaumont." "Have I?" Edward laughed. "Tell me, Your Grace, does it bother you? Knowing you're married to a man who can never truly see you as an equal, a man who married you out of, what was it? Pity, convenience." He leaned closer, his voice dropping but still audible to those nearby. "Certainly not love." Before Eleanor could respond, before she could summon the cutting reply forming in her mind, Thomas appeared at her side like a force of nature. "Beaumont." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. "You're drunk. You should leave." Edward straightened, emboldened by wine and the audience. "I'm simply speaking truths everyone else is too polite to." "The only truth here," Thomas interrupted, his voice dropping to ice. "Is that you're a coward who publicly humiliated a woman because she no longer served your financial purposes? You're also a fool who cannot recognize value unless it's measured in pounds sterling." The ballroom fell completely silent. Even the orchestra seemed to pause between movements. Thomas continued, his words precise and devastating. "My wife may have lost her fortune, but she possesses something you will never understand: genuine character. She has intelligence that puts most of Parliament to shame. She has strength that weathered your cruelty and society's judgment without breaking. She has dignity and integrity that you couldn't buy with 10 times your family's wealth." He paused, and his hand found Eleanor's, gripping it firmly. "She manages one of England's largest estates with more skill than most men born to it. She engages with political and philosophical questions that would leave you baffled. She treats everyone from duchesses to scullery maids with the same respect and kindness. She has built charitable initiatives that will improve hundreds of lives." Edward's face had gone from flushed to pale, but Thomas wasn't finished. "You called me a fool for marrying a pauper," Thomas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "The truth is, I would have been a fool to marry anyone else. Eleanor is not my duchess because I needed a household manager or because I pitied her. She is my duchess because she is the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and if you cannot see that, then you are even more pathetic than I believed." Edward tried to rally, opening his mouth for a response, but Thomas cut him off with a look that could freeze steel. "You will apologize to my wife," Thomas said with quiet finality. "Now, or you will find yourself unwelcome in every respectable house in London. I promise you this." The threat was not empty. Thomas had that power socially, politically, financially. Everyone in the ballroom knew it. Edward swallowed hard, trapped by his own pride and Thomas's absolute certainty. My apologies, Your Grace," he managed, the words directed at Thomas. "Not to me," Thomas said coldly. "To her." Edward's gaze finally shifted to Eleanor. "My apologies," he forced out, the words strangled. "Accepted," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. Edward fled with Lady Catherine, who looked ready to sink through the floor. The moment they disappeared through the doors, the ballroom erupted in whispered conversations. But the mood had shifted. Ladies who'd been uncertain about Eleanor approached with warm greetings. Lord Ashcroft clapped Thomas on the shoulder, commending his admirable loyalty. Lady Jersey remarked loudly that it was refreshing to see genuine devotion in a marriage. The Duchess of Marlborough found Eleanor and squeezed her hand. "Well, my dear," she said with a knowing smile, "I'd say you've been thoroughly claimed. Most romantically, I might add." Eleanor barely heard any of it. Her attention was fixed on Thomas, on the way he'd defended her so completely, so publicly. He'd laid bare his feelings in front of everyone who mattered. Across the room, Eleanor noticed Lady Vivian Blackwood standing frozen, her face pale, watching the entire scene unfold. As the crowd shifted and conversations resumed, Vivian approached. Eleanor found herself momentarily alone as Thomas was pulled into conversation with Lord Pemberton. "You've won," Vivian said quietly, her polished facade cracking for the first time. "I hope you realize that." Eleanor studied the woman who'd tried so hard to undermine her marriage. Up close, she could see the brittleness beneath Vivian's beauty, the desperation hidden by perfect manners. "This was never a competition, Lady Vivian," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "I'm sorry you believed it was. He never defended me that way." Vivian's voice was barely audible. "Never spoke of me with such—" She couldn't finish, but Eleanor understood, with such conviction, such feeling, such love. "Perhaps," Eleanor said gently, "because what Thomas and I have built is real, not performed, not calculated for social advantage, just real." Vivian's eyes glistened, but she blinked rapidly and straightened. Without another word, she turned and walked away, defeated, not by Eleanor's triumph, but by recognizing what she'd never had with Thomas and never would. Thomas materialized at Eleanor's side. "Dance with me?" Eleanor took his hand, and they moved to the floor as the orchestra began a waltz. Thomas pulled her closer than strict propriety allowed, and Eleanor found she didn't care. "I meant every word," he said quietly. His voice meant only for her. "I know," Eleanor whispered. "That's what made it so powerful." Thomas's hand tightened at her waist. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something. This marriage stopped being merely practical for me some time ago. I don't know precisely when it changed. somewhere between your reorganization of the household accounts and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, between watching you handle society's cruelty with grace and seeing you bring genuine joy to our household staff. But it changed. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she was certain Thomas could feel it. Changed how? Thomas met her eyes, and Eleanor saw everything he usually kept: hidden vulnerability, hope, fear, and something that looked remarkably like love. "I've come to care for you deeply," he said, each word deliberate. "More than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone." Eleanor stopped dancing, right there in the middle of the ballroom floor, and looked up at him. "That's fortunate," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "because I've fallen in love with my own husband, which seems like it should be common but feels entirely unexpected." Thomas's expression transformed the careful control, dissolving into something open and genuine. He smiled, truly smiled. Not the polite expression he showed society, but something real and unguarded. "Unexpected indeed," he said softly, "but not unwelcome? Not even slightly unwelcome." They resumed dancing, but closer now, with the barrier of formality finally dissolved. Eleanor was acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, his hand at her waist, her hand in his, the way they moved together as though they'd been dancing like this for years. "Can we leave?" Thomas murmured against her ear. "I find I have very little interest in spending the rest of the evening making polite conversation when I could be alone with my wife." Eleanor laughed, the sound pure joy. "Yes, please, yes." They made their excuses to the Duchess of Marlborough, who looked at them with knowing amusement. "Young love," she said, patting Eleanor's hand. "Go, my dears. Everyone here has already witnessed quite enough drama for one evening." In the carriage, Thomas pulled Eleanor close, and she went willingly, settling against his side with his arm around her shoulders, their hands intertwined, fingers threading together as though they'd been doing this forever. "I should tell you," Thomas said, "I've arranged for your father's remaining debts to be fully settled. Everything. I met with his solicitors this afternoon." Eleanor turned to look at him. "Thomas, you've already been so generous." "I want to," he interrupted gently. "Your family's peace matters to you, therefore it matters to me. That's how partnership works. That's how love works." The word hung between them, love, finally spoken aloud, finally acknowledged. "Love," Eleanor repeated softly, testing the word. "Love," Thomas confirmed, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. Inconvenient, unexpected, and entirely essential. When they arrived at Ashford House, they walked upstairs together in charged silence. At the landing where the corridor split toward their separate bedchambers, Thomas paused. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion and desire, "I know we agreed to separate chambers, but I wonder, would you prefer—" "Yes," Eleanor interrupted. Thomas laughed softly. "I didn't finish the question." "You didn't need to." Eleanor moved closer, her hand finding his cheek. "Yes, to whatever genuine partnership between us looks like. Yes, to building something real together. Yes, to all of it." Thomas's eyes darkened with emotion. He leaned down and kissed her, not the brief, formal kiss from their wedding, but something real and deep and full of promise. Eleanor's arms wound around his neck, and she kissed him back with all the feeling she'd been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Come with me," he whispered. Eleanor took his hand, and together they walked to Thomas's chambers. The door closed behind them on a marriage that had finally become everything a marriage should be: partnership and passion, respect and romance, friendship and love, all woven together into something neither of them had expected, but both now treasured beyond measure. 6 months later, autumn painted Ashford Estate in golds and russets. Eleanor sat in the estate office with Thomas and Mr. Pemberton, reviewing harvest reports, completely comfortable in her role. Her suggestions on crop rotation had proven remarkably successful, and the estate was thriving. "Excellent work, Your Grace," Mr. Pemberton said, gathering his papers. "The tenant families are already seeing the benefits." After he left, Eleanor turned to Thomas. "My parents are visiting again next week. Father wants to see the new school." "How is he?" Thomas asked, setting aside his own papers. "Better, much better." Eleanor smiled. "Without the constant worry about creditors, his health has improved remarkably. Mother says he's almost his old self again." Eleanor had established several charitable initiatives. The school for tenant children had been just the beginning. She'd also started a lending library for the village, and was working with the Duchess of Marlborough on a larger project to help families in London's poorest districts. Society no longer questioned her position. She was recognized as one of the most capable and respected duchesses in England, her opinions sought on matters of charity, estate management, and even political reform. That evening, Eleanor found Thomas in the library, working on correspondence. She settled into the chair beside him, picking up her book. Their feet touched companionably, a small intimacy that had become habit. Thomas set down his pen and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about our wedding day," he said. "How terrified I was that I'd made a terrible mistake, rushed into something reckless." Eleanor closed her book and met his eyes. "And now? Now I realize it was the least reckless thing I've ever done. Marrying you was the only decision I've made that was entirely right." Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed to him, settling into his lap. Thomas's arms came around her automatically, holding her close. "Only a fool would marry a pauper," Edward said. Eleanor murmured against his shoulder. Thomas's laugh rumbled through his chest. "Then I'm the wisest fool in England." They sat together in the firelit library, completely at peace in the unexpected love they'd built. Outside, autumn rain began to fall, but inside, everything was warm and perfect, and exactly as it should be. What began as desperation and ended as devotion proved that sometimes the best love stories start with the least romantic beginnings, and sometimes the marriage that saves you is the one you never saw coming. And there you have it, Eleanor and Thomas's journey, from a desperate arrangement to a love that defied all of society's expectations. Sometimes the most practical decisions lead to the most profound connections. If Eleanor's strength in the face of rejection touched your heart, or if Thomas's unwavering defense of his wife gave you chills, let me know in the comments below. Which moment was your favorite? Was it their honest proposal, the charity musicale, or that powerful ballroom confrontation? And here's a question for you. Do you believe respect and partnership make a stronger foundation for love than passion alone? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience, redemption, and unexpected romance, please show your support by hitting that like button. It truly helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more stories like Eleanor and Thomas's. Don't forget to subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new tale. I upload fresh historical romance audiobooks every week, each one crafted with complex characters, authentic emotions, and love stories that feel real. Share this story with someone who loves tales of strong women finding their place in the world, or anyone who believes that the best love stories aren't always the ones that start with love at first sight. Thank you so much for spending this time with me in 1812 London. Until our next story, remember sometimes the partnership you never expected becomes the love you never knew you needed. This is Lyra, and I'll see you in the next video.